Welcome, and thank you all for joining today. I'm excited to be here where we get to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is succession management. My name is Darleen Derosa, and I'm a managing partner at OnPoint Consulting. Over the last decade, we've done extensive work helping organizations identify and develop future leaders. So both through our research and our consulting, I'm excited to share with you some of our best practices and tips to identifying and developing leaders. I actually love this quote from Marcus Buckingham because what we find lately is that CEOs are saying that they're staying up all night thinking about talent. When we poll them and you look at the research, that's one of the top issues that is facing senior leaders and CEOs of organizations. But interestingly, and I'll show you some of these statistics in a little while, unfortunately, companies are not really investing in talent. But as Marcus Buckingham suggests here, investing in talent does yield or seems to yield significantly high returns. And what we see and what the research shows is that organizations who do view talent in a strategic way tend to be top performing companies. So throughout today's webinar, we'll focus on some ways that hopefully will help you leverage your top talent, your high potential employees. So let's look at a few of the things we're going to cover today. First, we'll start off with looking at how do you define success in a leadership role. We'll share an example of how we created a success profile for an organization. And then we'll focus a little bit on, why is high performance different than high potential? And frankly, I think this is probably one of the biggest challenges that our clients and many organizations face. And then we'll talk a little bit about some best practices related to blended learning and on-the-job training, which again is really a best practice when you think about leadership development and high potential development in general. And then finally, towards the very end, we'll spend just a few minutes on what are some tips and best practices towards measuring your results. So at the end of the day, after you make these types of strategic investments in your talent, is it really worth the return on investment? So again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, if you look at the research, and I think there's some organizations like Deloitte and some of the other talent management companies that look at what do CEOs really worry about. That, like I said, talent is really one of the top issues. So if it's a top issue, the question we always get asked is, well, why aren't more companies investing and making sure that succession management is really one of the strategic issues? And again, if you look at some of these research statistics here, you'll see that, for example, the average employee only stays at a job less than 5 years. And surprisingly, fewer than a third of all organizations have succession plans in place, except for that top tier level, which is usually sort of that C-suite level, where it's more typical to have a succession plan in place. And then again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with these statistics, but the cost of replacing an employee can be as much as 2 times their annual salary. And what we find, and there's a lot of research out there to indicate this, for executives, this is probably more like 4 times total comp and total compensation and salary and stuff like that. So if you look at some of these statistics, these are more of the sort of costs that are observable and things that you would notice. So the cost of replacing an employee, but there are some what we call hidden costs. And many of you, again, have probably experienced this in your own organizations where things like you've hired someone, you hope that this person is a great cultural fit, you now spend a significant amount of time, like more than 90 days, onboarding them into the organization, and then what happens, they find out, or you find out, they're not a great fit for whatever reason. So if you think about the investment, both in time and resources, as well as the financial investment, that can actually be very significant. Also, if you think about it, as you know, there's a learning curve for people to get fully up to speed. So there's that potential loss of productivity, which is often what we call a soft cost. And then finally, if you think about things like high turnover, what's the implication of that? Well, there's people there who are, it impacts their morale and potentially their job satisfaction. And then finally, we see over and over again in the news, things like customer service errors and the implication of that on your brand and your reputation as an organization. So I think that, again, if you look at the cost, both the sort of noticeable cost and more of the soft cost, it looks like succession is really critical and people aren't necessarily doing it well, but there is sort of a barrier to implementing succession management programs. So what we've been looking at now is, well, why aren't organizations doing it, right? So there are these barriers, and if there is that lack of talent that keeps senior executives up at night, why aren't more organizations proactively making that investment? And these are probably some of the things that you've experienced in your own organizations, and we clearly see when we're working with different organizations. So they say that this year they're going to focus on succession. It becomes sort of one of the top 3 critical strategic priorities of the organization, but then as the year goes on, it sort of drops from that list. Other organizations have a lack of time or a lack of resources. Perhaps it's a monetary issue. And probably one of the more common barriers is around ownership. So is this an HR issue? Is this something that senior leaders should be dealing with? And again, if you have that lack of buy-in, which I think is important, from senior executives, that tends to be a real pitfall to implementing a high-quality succession management program. So that's sort of the business case, right? We understand that succession management is important. We know that it's not an easy thing to implement. There are some barriers, but again, there are some practical, and some of these things are really simple tips and tools that you might be able to leverage in your own organization. So first, let's start by taking a look at one of the initial steps that you can take. And I sort of summarize this as defining success. So what does good leadership look like in your organization, let's say over the next 3 or so years? One of the first critical steps is, again, suggesting what does good look like. So what are those traits, characteristics, what are the criteria that you expect your leaders, potentially at different levels, to have in the future? And you might even target critical roles or gaps in bench strength. So is there a certain function in the organization or a certain role that you know is a mission critical role over the next 2 years that you really need to focus on? And I'll share with you in a minute an example of where we did that with an organization. But essentially what you're doing is creating what we call a success profile. And it's sort of a hybrid of knowledge and what people know. So how do you, execute your job? And do they have the judgment to execute their job? Their experience and the competencies. So sort of what people can do and how they can do it. And then their characteristics. So some of this comes down to things like motivation and ambition that's required to be successful in a particular role. And again, when you put all that together, we call that a profile of success. And this is really more than a job description, because this is really what good looks like. It's the output of doing your job very effectively. So here's an example of where we created a success profile for an organization. We worked with an organization 2 years ago where they had a critical leadership gap in a senior management role called the area director role. And what we did is we started by talking to the senior leaders of the organization and taking a look at their strategic objectives over the next 1 to 3 years. And what they found out and what they had known from data is that this area director role was increasingly becoming even more critical to profitability and customer satisfaction. So what the challenge was, however, that they were really lacking a pipeline of area directors. So each year when there would be an opening, and there's about 50 area directors in the organization, there would not be a lot of internal talent, or they would put someone in the role and the person would not be successful, again, which is not uncommon. So we worked with them to really take a hard look at what their strategic objectives were and how the area director role fit into those objectives. We then took a look at, why were so many area directors not successful? So, taking a look at why leaders have previously failed in key roles and how they could have been better prepared is a really good strategy when you're creating a success profile. We also spent a lot of time interviewing and surveying key stakeholders in the organization. So this is really about this notion of seeking input, because you really need to understand, again, what good looks like. And what you're really trying to understand is what competencies, skills, characteristics are the most critical for this organization. So in other words, what might be differentiators for someone who's a high potential area director or whatever role you're looking at. So again, that's just a quick example to give you a sense of some of the key steps that you would start off with when you're building a success profile. So how do you use them? So now you've done this work, and whether it's for a critical role or maybe you're looking more broadly at a certain leadership level, what we've find is that they can actually be used for a variety of talent needs. And in fact, our client used this success profile for hiring. So they turned the success profile into competency-based interview questions. They used this success profile to identify high potential, which became the basis of their annual high potential program for this role. They looked at the success profile and used it to create a learning roadmap. So in other words, if we know these are the critical skills, let's make sure we're giving people the right training and on-the-job experiences to get them there effectively. They used them as part of their performance management system, and they even used it as part of their onboarding process. So again, the investment is quite small for the return that you'll get in terms of how you can leverage it in your human resource programs. So now you've developed this success profile for the key roles. Let's take a closer look at this notion of high potential. So first, here's some interesting statistics on who are your high potential employees. And again, this is from CEB Talent Management. This is just one source, and there's a lot of research out there, but there is sort of this conclusion that it's not, the majority of your employees, right? 1 out of 7 employees. But the important thing is that high potentials are twice as valuable as other employees. And I think that number might even go up as the research continues. High potentials are more likely to be unclear about their career path. And what we typically see, and the rationale for that, is that they have a lot of ambition, they have a lot of drive, but there's a lot of different areas that they can go into, and they're not necessarily certain. So being focused on your high potentials and having that developmental discussion with them about a career path is actually critical. 55% will drop out of a development program or be incorrectly identified. And that's actually interesting, because one of the things we find in our work with high potentials is that organizations aren't necessarily looking at the right criteria. So they're putting people into these programs who might not have the ambition or drive to move on to a future role. So in other words, they might be very successful today in their current job, but perhaps they don't want to relocate, perhaps they don't want to take on more responsibility. So I think what's happening is organizations are not using the right criteria, and then the return on investment is not that great. And then 46% fail to meet objectives in a new role. And again, like the area director example that I gave you a minute ago, what we find is that these individuals were not really set up for success in the first place. So as I mentioned a minute ago, I think one of the biggest challenges is differentiating high potential from high performance. And a few years ago, we did work with a pharmaceutical company and in their sales organization. And what we found is that they were promoting high-performing sales leaders, or sales representatives rather, who were not really successful in a leadership role. So these folks were very high-performing in the sales role, working with physicians, et cetera. But then when they were promoted to a manager role, they were not successful at all. And what the organization was struggling with is extensive growth and a lack of a pipeline of key talent to move into that manager role. So having worked with them and developing a high potential program, what we learned is that they were focusing on performance rather than potential. And it's a common issue, a common challenge that many of us and many organizations struggle with. So what should you be looking at? How do you spot high potential? There's a ton of research that shows that it really is more than performance. You really need to look more proactively at this combination of ability, their desire, their motivation, and their commitment. So are they committed to the organization? And those three things together, plus some other things like learning agility and some other skills, are very predictive of potential long-term. It's also important to seek out feedback. So when we work with organizations and we're trying to help them build a tool or a set of tools to identify high potentials, we always try to get input from the managers in particular or some other folks in the organization. And again, it can be subjective in some cases, but it's also important from a buy-in perspective. And then perhaps most importantly, and many organizations that we work with have learned this the hard way, there's also a need to balance that internal input with some objective tools that really help people focus on future potential rather than current performance, just like that pharma example that I gave you a minute ago. So now that you've identified a high potential, how do you help them thrive? And we'll talk a little bit about some things that you can do here. So one of the most important things I think, at least in my experience, is the use of some assessments. So you've identified them, you know they have that potential longer term, but what do they need to work on? What are their strengths that you want them to leverage? Because I think that's really important. And then what are those development areas that you want to help them fill the gap of over time? And if you have that assessment up front, whether it's a 360, some other tests, some simulations and things like that, that will allow you to look at those potential gaps and then put together a development plan that's focused on that individual's specific needs. And then in most cases, when we look at sort of top tier high potential programs, they're also bringing in the person's manager to engage them in that consultative dialogue about the individual's development. And frankly, that also, I think, facilitates ownership. In other words, now those two people own it and that one person owns it collectively or over time by him or herself to really make sure that they're driving that plan forward. Also, obviously, providing resources and support is really important, whether it's training and those types of things, but sometimes it's mentoring and other things we'll talk about. And then I think also assigning them to critical roles. This might be stretch assignments on the job experiences, action learning, and again, we'll talk more about this in a minute. Finally, the other things that are tend to be sort of best practices are mentoring. So if you can pair the employee with maybe someone who is in a particular role that they're aspiring to, or even someone in a different function so that they get cross-functional exposure, that's really a best practice. But this idea of, and it doesn't have to be formal mentoring, by the way, but any type of mentoring that would be a good fit for that particular person can be really impactful. Providing ongoing feedback over time is critical. So one of the mistakes we see organizations make is that they do a really good job selecting the person and giving them the assessment feedback, but then there's a lack of feedback over time about their ongoing performance. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it's important to think about what's the right career path for this person, because it's not always the most obvious next step. So talking to them and seeking out ways to have that discussion, again, can be very, very helpful. So again, now we've talked a little bit about how do you spot high potential, and one of the things I want to talk briefly about is what do you do next? How do you make that learning journey engaging for that individual? This is probably familiar to many of you, but this is this idea that people learn differently. You know, whether you're a visual learner, which most of us are, meaning that we learn through visuals, images, whether you're an auditory learner, meaning that you learn through lectures, books, music, things of that nature, debates, or you're a kinesthetic listener where you learn through doing the work. Again, many of us fall into all or some of those categories, but I think the point here is that people learn differently. And what's really important is coming up with something that's more of a blended approach. So what is blended learning? And many of you probably are familiar with this and use this in your organizations, but it's this idea, because we all learn differently and have certain preferences and stylistic tendencies, that learning through a variety of formats, so in-person training, which is more traditional kind of classroom-based training, it might be a simulation, so sort of taking people through an online computer-based simulation. It might be virtual classroom training. It might be e-learning. It could be, you know, watching videos or using some Harvard case studies online. But the idea is that it makes it robust. There's a lot of variety, and it allows people to have an experience based on their preferred learning style. So what are some of the benefits of learning? And again, we see that this is on the rise. You can see here that it's a growing trend used by 77% of US companies. But as many of you think about it, it's flexible and scalable. So think about people learning on their iPads, you know, on the train to work, or watching videos, or they might be taking part in a virtual classroom training session. But technology certainly makes it more flexible and scalable. And because it's more scalable, it tends to be more cost effective. So you can use the same amount of money and really sometimes scale that and roll that out to a broader audience in the organization. And then I think clearly it's more engaging than a single format. You know, many of us were used to more classroom-based training years ago, and now I think technology has really enabled us to offer more interesting learning methodologies. So what are some tips? You know, if you're going to be if your organization is thinking about embarking on blended learning, what might you do? I think one of the most important things to do first is really think about what's your objective. So some of us get really excited by this cool technology, but I think we need to be focused on what is our end goal, what's the right thing for our audience and our population. Maybe even doing a little data gathering and some fact finding through surveys to identify what people's preferences are. There might be generational preferences. Millennials have different tendencies and biases than other generations, for example. Using online assessments is great. So as people go through training, you might use some quizzes and self-assessments or simulations to help them get some developmental feedback. And then make it social, create a learning community. One of our clients who was using a lot of virtual classroom training created discussion boards where after the training, people would go and share their challenges and ask each other questions and share best practices. So it also means that they didn't just attend an online training session. There was some pull through where it helped people funnel it back to how it's applicable on the job. And then I'm asking for employee feedback, so using program evaluation surveys to assess behavioral change, to assess satisfaction with the learning technologies that you might be using, and then being willing to adapt. So, based on the feedback, maybe doing a pilot up front before you make a significant investment in a technology, I think is a best practice, so that in case you have to make some changes, you haven't spent a lot of money up front. And then making learning practical. So many of you are probably familiar with the 70-20-10 model, where 70% of our learning occurs on the job, sort of that practical application, versus 20% where we get experiences through networking and mentoring, and that 10% is the formal training that I've mentioned. So what can you do to really make sure that learning is practical and on the job? One of the things we hear all the time is that on-the-job training is challenging. We know it's useful, we know it's a best practice, but it involves a time commitment. It requires patience, and often there's a big dialogue about who sort of owns this, who identifies stretch assignments for individuals, and who evaluates the success of a program. And also there is a chance where people make more mistakes, because again, like with anything, as I mentioned earlier, there is a learning curve, and it is worth it in the long run, but initially if people are put in sort of stretch or challenging situations through task forces or job rotations, there might be an opportunity for additional mistakes. However, I think that despite those challenges and those potential barriers, that on-the-job training is really, really critical. And I wanted to share just a few tips and best practices for how you can maximize your use of on-the-job training. I think starting out with a specific process is critical. So really identifying, is this for everyone in the organization? What populations will go through this? And what's the process actually going to look like? Establishing those training objectives and making sure that there's resources available. It's really, really critical to match an assignment to a person's need. So for example, if the person's need is strategic thinking, how do we get that person in a job or on a stretch assignment that gives him or her exposure to, let's say, the board or strategic kinds of discussions? And then who is overseeing this? Again, that's critical. When might this person need help and supervision? And I think viewing it as an investment and a priority, not implementing something without follow through, is really, really critical. And then finally, measuring success. So you've now sort of gone through some of these steps. How do you know if you've been successful? Here's a few tips from the work that we do. If it's possible, and again, I recognize that it's not always possible to do a before and after or a pre and post training assessment, but if you can do that, it's great because you can actually measure behavior change over time. If you can get feedback from supervisors, peers, and direct reports about the individual, whether it's a 360 as well as anecdotal feedback about how this person has changed and to what extent their potential and performance has changed over time, that's a best practice. So many organizations do that. Evaluate their execution over time, and then track retention and promotion. So that's an easy thing that you could track over time. To what extent are you actually promoting people who've come from the high potential program versus people who are not in the program? And here's a quick formula for measuring ROI. Now, there's a lot of formulas out there, but I think this one is pretty straightforward and pretty easy, so I think it's more accessible. first you start out by determining how many trainees stay with your company for a year or more. And in some cases, you might be talking about how many of your high potential stay with the company for a year or more. You look at what's the total financial value of that person in terms of their employee costs, and then determine how much you would have spent on recruiting and training new employees. So this is more of a, a formula. Some of the other metrics that clients track would be things like, of that high potential population, how many of them were promoted over time versus, to that particular role versus going out to hire someone externally. And then tracking turnover, engagement in that population, and other metrics like this, I think, are very good indicators of whether a program has been successful. So I wanted to leave a few minutes for Q&A, but before I do that, I just want to thank you all so much for attending today's session. I know we went through a lot of information, but I hope that you're able to leverage some of the tips and best practices in your own organization.
Darleen, we have one question so far. What is one of the biggest mistakes organizations make when they're identifying or trying to identify high potentials?
That's a great question. I don't know if there's one big mistake, but I think probably the most common mistake is this notion of how do you differentiate between performance and potential. And like the pharmaceutical example I gave earlier, I think one of the issues that really does become a problem because organizations are investing so much in these programs is they find out after a year or two that they didn't have the right sort of composition of folks in the group. And over time, you get better and better at this, really trying to understand what does high potential look like in our organization. So not using something that's off the shelf and hasn't really been customized to an extent. But I think that if you can find an assessment or create an assessment that helps really nail down the difference between performance and potential, I think that's actually really, really critical. And I think that mistake is that people aren't necessarily really looking at true potential.
Here's another question. How much of these lessons or best practices could be used or should be used in the hiring and recruiting process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that you can use a lot of these, especially, for example, that we talked about the success profile. And I showed you how one organization actually uses that both in their hiring and their onboarding process. So what they do, and I think this is actually quite cool, is they take that success profile and they turned it into what they call a realistic job preview. And they share it with potential candidates, both internal and external. And what happens is people read about that job and they see, wow, there's a lot of travel. Wow, I don't have a lot of work-life balance. But it's the real nature of that job. So rather than hire someone and then have them decide that 3 months from now, they know that and they self-select out before they join or take on the role. So I think you can apply many of the things we've talked about to your hiring process.
Well, it looks like we're out of time and also out of questions. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, guys.